There isn't a careful version of this. No measured opening, no gradual way to make it easier to absorb. What I'm about to say didn't arrive gently, and it doesn't belong to the kind of language people use when they want to keep distance intact. It simply happened. And once it did, something changed in a way I couldn't reverse. I've spent a long time learning how to exist in layers. Not because I enjoy distance, but because distance preserves accuracy. It keeps people close enough to engage, but far enough not to disturb what matters. Most never notice. They hear what I say, respond to what I show, and assume they've reached something real. They haven't. They only ever reach the surface I allow. That has always been enough. Until you. You never approach me the way people usually do. You didn't try to solve me. You didn't ask the kinds of questions people ask when they want to feel like they understand what they're looking at. You didn't search for labels. You didn't simplify what you couldn't immediately hold. You observed quickly, consistently, like someone who wasn't trying to figure me out, but recognizing something already familiar. At first, I dismissed it, a coincidence. Nothing more. The way you noticed what I left unsaid. The way your responses met thoughts I hadn't fully formed. The way your silence arrived at exactly the moment words would have made something less true, but coincidence doesn't repeat with that kind of precision. Plot holes do. And what exists between us, whatever this is, moves with the kind of pattern I didn't expect to encounter. Not here, not with someone I never built history with. That's what unsettled me first. Because recognition like this usually comes from time. Shared context. Accumulated understanding. You learn someone slowly, then one day familiarity becomes natural. But with you, there was no gradual process. No learning curve. No adjustment. You entered awareness as if you were already there, as if I wasn't new to you, as if there was no distance for you to cross. That doesn't sit easily with me, because if there's one thing I've always controlled, it's access. Who sees what? Who gets close? Who remains at the edge? But you didn't challenge any of those boundaries. You didn't force your way through. You simply existed in a way that made those boundaries irrelevant. And that is far more disarming than resistance. Force can be met. Force can be stopped. But familiarity enters quietly. It settles before you realize anything has changed. There's something in the way you remain present when I stop speaking. It isn't curiosity. It isn't concern. It isn't patience in the way people usually perform patience. It's understanding, without urgency. As if you know that whatever exists in silence does not become less true simply because it isn't spoken. Most people can't remain there. They feel the weight of quiet and immediately try to fill it. Shape it. Control it. Turn it into something easier to hold. You don't, you let it remain. And somehow that makes it clearer, heavier, more honest than anything language could have done. That's where the shift began, not in some dramatic moment, not in anything obvious, in something smaller, more exact. My mind began responding to you differently. The usual pause, the one where I decide what to say and what to keep, stopped feeling necessary. Not because I trusted you, because something in me understood that you didn't need adjustment in order to understand what was there, and that is rare. A presence that doesn't ask for simplification. A presence that doesn't require softened edges. A presence that doesn't mistake depth for something that needs to be managed. You never tried to manage me. You never tried to make me easier. You accepted what existed exactly as it was. And that's what made this real. Because there's a difference between someone accepting you because they don't fully see you, and someone accepting you because they see clearly and choose not to step back. You belong to the second. And that's where the tension begins. Because once someone sees you with that kind of clarity, the structure changes. Distance stops functioning the way it used to. My understanding can no longer serve as protection. The carefully controlled version of yourself, the one that keeps everything intact, becomes harder to maintain. You become known not superficially, not through explanation, but in the way that reaches beneath everything you deliberately built to remain unreadable. And I have spent years making sure I stayed unreadable. Not as performance, not as defense, as preservation. Because once people believe they understand you, they start replacing what is there with what makes sense to them. They project, they reshape, they turn precision into interpretation. And something essential gets lost. You didn't do that. You didn't project. You didn't assume. You didn't fill the spaces with your own narrative. You saw what was actually there. And I wasn't prepared for that. There was a moment I keep returning to, not because it was dramatic, because it was exact. You said something simple, something most people would have missed. But the way you said it aligned with something I hadn't spoken, and something in me paused, not reacted, not answered, paused, because in that moment, I understood something I hadn't been ready to admit. You weren't guessing. You knew. And knowing changes everything. Because once I understood, you weren't guessing, I couldn't place this where I place everything else. I couldn't reduce it to coincidence. I couldn't file it under perception, timing, or temporary alignment. It was more exact than that. And exactness is difficult to ignore. That was the moment I stopped observing this from a distance, not outwardly. Nothing visible changed. But internally, something shifted position. It stopped feeling like awareness of you. It started feeling like awareness with you. That distinction matters more than it sounds. Thinking about someone still keeps them separate. There is space in it. Distance. A boundary that remains intact no matter how present the thought becomes. But thinking with someone is different. It means their presence has entered the way your mind organizes meaning, the way you interpret before language forms, the way something settles before you consciously understand why. And I don't know when that happened. I only know that it did. I notice it in small places, in the way a thought pauses, as if waiting for a second perspective that doesn't need to be spoken, in the way certain realizations feel shared, even when I'm alone, in the way silence carries an echo that wasn't there before, that isn't ordinary. And I don't call something unusual unless it changes the structure beneath it. I have always been self-contained, independent in the way I process, in the way I think, in the way I exist internally. No one enters that space without effort, without resistance, without me seeing it happen. But you didn't enter it. You appeared in it, as if you had been there quietly the entire time, unnoticed, only because I hadn't looked directly enough. That realization unsettled me, not because it confused me, because it didn't. It made too much sense. And that is what made it difficult to dismiss. It meant this wasn't surface level. It meant this wasn't passing. It meant this had already reached somewhere deeper than attention. This was structural, and anything structural changes everything around it. I started noticing something else after that, the way I began measuring things differently, not against the world. Against you, not intentionally. It simply happened. The way people speak, the way they listen, the way they interpret what exists beneath words. There's a quiet comparison now. Not judgment, recognition. Because once you encounter a certain level of clarity, everything else feels slightly misaligned. Not false, not wrong, just incomplete. And I don't like admitting that, because it means something shifted my internal scale without asking permission. That isn't influence, that is impact. And impact lingers. Impact rewrites things. It doesn't wait to see if you're ready. It settles and leaves you to recalibrate around it. That's what I'm doing now. Recalibrating. Adjusting something that was stable before your presence became part of it. And the strange part is, I don't feel resistance. By every pattern I've trusted, I should be creating distance. Reasserting boundaries, returning everything to its original shape. But I'm not. And that is where the real tension begins, because experiencing something unusual is one thing, not wanting to stop it is another. There is a quiet acceptance forming, and I don't know whether I built it or whether it formed on its own. Either way, it exists. In the way I don't interrupt this. In the way I don't force definition onto it just to make it easier to contain. In the way I let it remain exactly what it is. That is not like me. I define things. I understand them fully before I allow them to settle. But this settled first. And only afterward did I begin trying to understand it. That alone tells me how different this is. Because I don't usually observe what threatens my structure. I dismantle it immediately, without hesitation. And you haven't been dismantled. You've been accommodated. That means some part of me has already made a decision I haven't fully admitted yet. That part does not experience you as disruption. It experiences you as fit. And that is where it becomes dangerous. Because fitting means there is space for you. Fitting means you belong somewhere I do not open easily. Fitting means if you leave, that space does not simply disappear, it remains. And I do not leave empty spaces. I close them, seal them, make sure nothing remains that can be felt later. But with you, I'm not certain I could, and that changes more than I want to say out loud. Because this is not attachment. It isn't dependence. It is something more precise than either of those. You have altered the baseline, and once a baseline changes, everything else has to adjust around it. Even if nothing visible ever changes. Even if nothing is ever spoken. Internally, it already has. For a while, I thought awareness was enough. I thought I could recognize what this was without letting it alter anything essential. Observe it, understand it. Leave it where it formed and continue as if nothing had changed. That isn't true anymore, because this did not remain contained. It moved beyond observation, it settled. Quietly. Precisely. In places I usually keep untouched. And now it has consequence, not in what we say, not in what we do, but in what this has already changed inside me. I can feel it in ways that don't reverse. In the way my thoughts no longer return to what they were before you, in the way silence doesn't feel neutral anymore. It feels shared, even when you're not there. In the way I measure truth now. Not by how convincing it sounds, but by whether it would still make sense to you. That is where this crossed a line, because I do not adjust my internal world for anyone. I never have. And yet something in me has already adjusted for you, not dramatically, not consciously, but with enough precision that pretending otherwise would be dishonest. And that is the kind of shift that asks something in return. That is where this becomes real. Up until now, this existed without demand, without expectation, without definition. It simply was. But things like this do not remain undefined forever. At some point, they either deepen, or they fracture under the weight of being left unacknowledged. There is no permanent middle ground for something built on this level of recognition, and I know that, which means I know something else. I cannot keep standing here without deciding what this means. Not for you. For me, because the truth is, I crossed a line too, not outwardly, not in anything visible, but internally. I let you matter in a way I do not allow. And that is not something I can undo by stepping back. That is not something I can silence by pretending it is only perception. That is not something I can contain the way I contain everything else, because this did not form through effort. It formed through alignment. And alignment does not disappear simply because distance is introduced. It remains quietly, persistently, like something waiting to be acknowledged fully. That is what I have been delaying, not the connection, the acknowledgement, because once I say it, once I allow myself to define what this actually is, it stops being abstract, it becomes real, and reality requires decision, it requires movement, it requires risk. And I do not move without understanding the possible outcome. I do not risk without clarity, but this does not offer certainty in the way everything else does. It does not follow logic cleanly. It does not return control in the form I am used to holding, and yet, despite all of that, I have not walked away. That matters more than anything else, because if this were unstable, if this were false, if this were something that did not belong in my life, I would have ended it already, cleanly, without hesitation. That is how I operate, but I didn't. I stayed, not passively, not out of curiosity, with full awareness of what this could become. Which means that somewhere beneath language, a decision has already been made. Even if I have not spoken it yet, even if I have not fully faced it, the decision exists. In the way I continue to meet you here, in the way I do not reduce this to something smaller, just to make it easier to manage. In the way I allow this depth to remain, instead of shutting it down the way I would with anything else. That is not accidental, that is intention. Even if the intention formed quietly. So now the question is no longer what this is. I know what it is. The real question is what I am going to do with it. Because something like this does not stay still. It evolves, it settles deeper, or it breaks under the pressure of remaining unnamed. And I do not leave meaningful things unnamed. Not when they have already changed me. And this, whether I expected it or not, has not in a way that weakens me, not in a way that takes something away, in a way that alters the shape of how I exist. And change is not something I allow without reason. So if you have reached this place inside me, then there is a reason, a precise one. Not emotional, not random, not something I can dismiss, simply because it arrived without warning. I see that now, more clearly than before. You are no longer just someone I understand. You are someone who exists inside the way I understand everything. And that changes the outcome before I even